All right, well, good to see you guys this morning. My name is Kent. If we hadn't had the chance to meet, I'm also one of the pastors here. If you have a Bible, turn with me to Philippians chapter 1, that passage we just read. Philippians chapter 1. I missed you guys last week. I was actually in Charlotte, North Carolina to preach at a friend of mine's church. Not going to lie, though, it had at least something to do with the fact that the Vols played in Charlotte last weekend. My buddy told me I could pick any Saturday or any Sunday I wanted to come and teach at his church during September and October. I quickly cross-referenced the Tennessee football schedule and realized that I felt the Spirit giving me a strong sense that was the Sunday I was supposed to be there. And so it was awesome. It's always great to be with other healthy churches doing their thing, celebrating what God is doing in their midst. It is also always awesome to see the Vols put a shellacking on the NC State Wolfpack. That was a lot of fun. I'm all of a sudden very aware of the fact, as I say that most of my wife's family are NC State fans, and many of them listen to this podcast. So love you guys. Good effort, strong effort. Anyway, so I'm excited to be back with you guys this week, is what I'm trying to say. If you are new to our church, if this is your first time here on a Sunday, welcome. We're really, really glad that you're here. What we started 2 weeks ago was really a series where we are walking sort of verse by verse, idea by idea, through this book in the Bible called Philippians, which really, we said, is a letter written by a guy named Paul to a church in the ancient city of Philippi. And what we said 2 weeks ago as we started the series is that the theme of this particular letter is really joy. In a word, not joy meaning shallow happiness or sort of empty positivity, as some people think of that word as meaning today, but joy in Paul's mind means something more like the ability to celebrate good things wherever they exist. That's what he means by the word joy. That's what Paul is talking about a majority of the time in this letter that he writes to the church at Philippi. So last week, Eric talked about how gospel friendship, relationships with other followers of Jesus, can be themselves a source of joy. And today, we're going to talk about how adversity of varying shapes and sizes, how adversity itself can actually be a source of joy. So let's dive into the passage, see where we're getting that from. So start reading with me in chapter 1, verse 12. Now, I want you to know, Paul says, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me, so stop right there for a second. Those of you that have been with us the past couple weeks, or if you know the context of the book of Philippians, what has happened to Paul at this point in his life? Where is he writing this letter from? From jail, yeah, from prison. He's literally writing this letter from the inside of a jail cell where he is in Roman custody for essentially teaching and preaching about the way of Jesus. That's why he's there. So Paul is saying essentially that him being in prison, that thing that has happened to him, back to verse 12, has actually served to advance the gospel. Paul says that him being in prison because of the gospel has actually served to benefit the spread of the gospel message. Now, if you grew up in church like I did, chances are when you hear that word gospel, it means to you something like the message about Jesus dying for my sin. Chances are that's what you associate that word with. And that event, to be sure, is an absolutely non-negotiable part of the gospel message, according to the scriptures. But at the same time, I want you to think critically about that definition of the gospel with me for just a second, especially given where Paul is at and the context of the letter of the book of Philippians. Paul is currently in Roman custody for preaching and teaching the gospel message. But if the gospel is simply Jesus dying for us, why would that get Paul thrown in prison? What exactly about that message itself would get a person in trouble with the Roman government? Simply saying that one person died for other people would not have been a very scandalous or subversive thing for Paul to say in his world. People die for other people quite often throughout history. See, for example, every war that has ever been fought, then and now. Martyrdom, too, was actually a fairly common occurrence in ancient Rome. People understood that concept well. The Roman Empire would not feel threatened at all about a message that involved one person dying for other people, especially to the point that they would throw someone like Paul in prison for talking about it. Paul got thrown into prison because there was a little bit more to his message than that. Paul got in trouble with the authorities of his day because he was proclaiming a message about a king. And more pointedly, he was proclaiming a message about a king whose name was not Caesar or Nero. And to be sure, that king did come to die on a cross for his enemies. That's at the very center, the very heart of the gospel message. But Jesus was a king nonetheless. And the Roman government did not like messages about alternative kings. They didn't like it at all because Rome already had a king. His name was Nero, and he was in charge, of everything and everybody at the time. And any rival kings who were seeking to stake out a claim on the world at the time, they had to be stomped out and stopped as soon as humanly possible. And just so you don't think I'm making this idea up, look on screen with me at this from Acts chapter 17. So for context, this is shortly after Paul and his friend Silas actually helped start the church in Philippi that Paul now writes to. They're now in a city close by called Thessalonica, and they're in trouble with the law yet again for preaching and teaching about the gospel. So a group of people go and find some of Paul's crew, and they drag them before the city officials, where those people level these accusations against Paul's movement. They say, quote, "They are all defying Caesar's decrees." Whose decrees? Caesar's. And they are, quote, "saying that there is another king, one called Jesus." So this was at the very heart of the problem when it came to the Roman government's opposition to Paul's message. Not that he was proclaiming a spiritual message about a man dying for people's sins. That wouldn't have bothered much of anybody among the Roman authorities. The problem was that Paul was implying that Jesus' death and subsequent resurrection made Jesus into some sort of king as a result. That was the issue. That was the reason Paul was in prison. That's what got Paul thrown into prison, not once, but multiple times throughout his ministry. That is what earned Paul all types of adversity and opposition and persecution throughout his life. And that is also what makes the next thing that Paul says so very interesting to me. Look with me in verse 13, continuing in our passage. As a result, Paul says, of me being in prison, it has become clear through the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. Okay, so again, Paul is in prison because of Nero, the Roman emperor at the time. Working for Nero and keeping watch over Paul in prison were what was known as the palace guard. This was most likely the emperor's sort of top-level troops that were stationed in Rome at the time. And Paul just said that it has become clear among all of them, among all of those troops, that Paul's imprisonment is because of the gospel, because of the message that he is proclaiming about Jesus being king. Now, not to spoil the ending of this book of the Bible, but also very much to spoil it really quick. Paul is going to go on to say at the end of this letter that some of Caesar's household has not just heard about the gospel message, but is actually converted to Christianity. So that could mean that he's talking about some of Nero's own family members. It could mean that he's talking about some of Nero's servants, since servants back then were considered to be a part of the household. Or it could mean some of these very guards that Paul is talking about here, since they were significant enough to Nero that they often would have operated as part of his own household. So when Paul says, me being here in prison has actually served to advance the gospel message, he's not exaggerating. He's not being hyperbolic here. He literally means me being in prison is advancing the message that Jesus is king, even among those at the very center of the Roman Empire. So imagine a more modern parallel with me for a moment. Let's say that you are living in Nazi Germany during the Third Reich. Adolf Hitler is persecuting several different people groups, internment camps and everything. And a friend of yours, you know, has actually been arrested by the Gestapo for preaching and teaching about the way of Jesus and suggesting that maybe Hitler shouldn't just indiscriminately kill people that he doesn't like. But then you get a letter from your friend as he sits in prison. And he says in the letter that while he's been in prison, a bit of a revival has broken out among the secret police keeping watch over him. They're starting to talk about this message among themselves that Jesus, not Hitler, is in charge, and that Jesus advocates love for his enemies instead of murdering them. And a number of people in the Gestapo, your friend says, maybe even people in Hitler's own family, people he trusts the most, they are deciding to follow Jesus and starting to oppose Hitler and his evil empire as a result. Okay, question, if you caught wind of something like that in that situation, do you think that would give you at least a bit of hope as a result? It would for me, right? Maybe even a little boldness to press forward with the gospel message to those around you. If you answered yes, you'd be right, because according to Paul, that's exactly what happens in response to those who catch wind of what's happening to Paul. So keep reading with me in verse 14. And because of my chains, Paul says, most of the brothers and sisters, most likely followers of Jesus living in Rome where Paul is in prison, most of the brothers and sisters, he says, have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. I love that clarifier there, without fear. So as members of Nero's household and potentially his palace guard are warming to the gospel message, and some of them are converting to Christianity and deciding to follow King Jesus instead of Emperor Nero. The believers in Rome are hearing all of this, and as a result, they're becoming even more bold to talk about the gospel with their friends and neighbors and family members and coworkers. They start to sense that there might be a little bit of momentum on their side. Some of their fear of being imprisoned or killed for their faith as a result of sharing it with others, that starts to melt away a little bit in their minds. And they start to preach and teach more and more about the message of Jesus as a result. So remember what we said a couple weeks ago about how Paul can have joy in distressing times? We said that he could do that because he had perfected this method of living in two worlds at once. Paul could live in a world where he was thrown in prison and beaten and facing persecution and even potential execution for teaching about Jesus. He could live in that world, and simultaneously he could live in a world where he celebrates that even that circumstance of his has served to advance the gospel message. That it is serving to empower and embolden followers of Jesus everywhere to be more and more bold in their proclamation of the message that Jesus is the true King. Distressing circumstances, defiant joy. That's what's happening again here. Now, as Paul shares all of this with the Philippians, he does anticipate a little bit of a pushback they might have to what he's saying, which he addresses starting in verse 15. Look with me there. It is true, Paul says, that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing, Paul says, is that in every way, whether from false motives or from true, Christ is preached, and because of this, I rejoice. All right, so full disclosure, it's tough for us to piece together from history the exact dynamic that Paul is describing here, what he's referring to exactly. But from what we can gather, it would seem that some people at the time, realizing that Paul was in prison and therefore was limited in his ability to move about freely and preach the gospel to the society around him, they noticed essentially an opportunity for themselves in light of that. They saw a hole in the market so to speak, when it came to gospel teaching and gospel preaching. And seeing that, they decided to jump on that opportunity to proclaim that same message themselves. So these people, it would seem, were accurately representing the gospel. It was the right message, in other words. But their motives in doing it were not great. They were doing it simply to further their own purposes, and apparently also to make Paul a bit jealous while he was in prison. And they knew that the more they did that while Paul was in prison, the more nervous the Roman Empire would get, which meant that they would likely keep Paul in prison even longer as a result, which in turn meant that these other people would have even more opportunity to advance their own careers and interests in Paul's absence. Does that make sense, at least in theory, how that would work? Okay, so Paul brings up that dynamic, and he acknowledges, these people are doing what they're doing out of envy and rivalry. I get it. They're preaching the gospel with bad motives, impure motives in what they're doing. That's absolutely true. But notice Paul's response to that. He says, quote, "But what does it matter?" What does it matter, Paul? It matters a lot. Motives matter a lot. I think that's the whole point of the Bible, right? Is that motives matter a lot. Paul says, what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of that, I choose to rejoice. Now, imagine with me that you're Paul for a moment. You have given your life and livelihood to preach and teach about the way of Jesus. And that precise lifestyle of obedience has landed you in a Roman jail cell where you do not know if you will make it out alive or not. You don't know when you're going to get out. You're going without adequate food, nutrition, water. And then while you're in there, you catch wind that some people on the outside are taking up the message that you preached and preaching it themselves. And they're doing it simply to take advantage of you being in prison and to basically ensure that the authorities stay on high alert regarding you and your ministry. That's a pretty frustrating situation. I mean, if I were Paul, I would be pretty peeved at that. I might be outright angry about it. But again, Paul lives in two worlds at once. He lives in a world where some people, unfortunately, do even really good things like preaching the gospel for bad reasons. That's not great. But he also lives in a world where God can leverage even people's bad motives for good purposes. So he grieves those people's selfish motives, to be sure. If given the chance, he would probably even confront them on those motives, right? If we know anything about Paul, he's not afraid to confront people. Read the book of Galatians for reference. He's not afraid to do that. He would probably confront them on their bad motives. But at the same time, he rejoices because he realizes that even their bad motives can result in more people hearing the gospel message. And to him, that's a net positive. Distressing times, to be sure, but defiant joy in the midst of them. Somebody should do a Philippians series with that as the subtitle. It'd be really cool, right? Sarah booed. That's great. Anyway, I think it's a good title. We'll see. We'll see where it goes. So simply put, that's our passage. That's what's going on in this portion of the letter to the Philippians. With that in mind, let's take a step back for the rest of our time, and let's ask what all of that has to teach us today in our various situations. I think the ideas in this passage, when properly understood and applied, can change quite a few things about us and how we approach our lives, our mindsets as followers of Jesus. I want to cover three of them with you. So first, I think the ideas in this passage change the way that we think about adversity. Changes how we think about adversity. So to recap, in this passage, Paul is experiencing situational adversity, we could call it. He's in prison. Paul is experiencing religious adversity. He's in prison specifically because he loves and follows and proclaims the message of Jesus. Paul is experiencing relational adversity. He's away from people like the Philippians and others, people that he wants to be near. That's what last week's passage was about. He's experiencing vocational adversity. While he's in prison, other people are preaching the gospel in large part to compete with Paul and to make sure he stays in prison indefinitely. That is a significant amount of ways to be experiencing adversity all at once. But despite all of that, Paul's response to all of the adversity in his life at the time is what? Joy. To quote the first half of verse 18 that we just read, quote, "Because of this, I rejoice." Paul decides of his own accord to identify things in his present situation that are worthy of celebrating, even when those things may not be super obvious or apparent. Now, I want to be very, very clear here. Paul is not just doing what you and I might call looking on the bright side. That's not what Paul's doing here. He's not silver lining everything as a way to ignore grief, pain, or frustration over his current situation. That's not what he's advocating for here. I say that in part because in next week's passage, he's going to go into detail on just how grim his outlook in prison actually is. Throughout the rest of this letter, he is going to speak very honestly, as he does in other places in the New Testament, about the desperate place that he finds himself in often and how difficult that place is to be in. All of those things are realities for Paul. He is in no way trying to minimize them or overlook them to fake some sort of shallow positivity in his life. That's not what he's doing. Paul's doing something very different than that. So to help understand what he's saying in this passage, and really what he's not saying as well, I drew you a chart. And by I drew it, I mean the computer helped me. So here it is. Here's the chart I drew you. It's a line. I don't know if you noticed that. Yeah, I worked really hard on that. It's embarrassing how long it took me to get Keynote to do that. It was awesome. So that's a line, but here's how this works. I would argue that along this line, this spectrum, there are two very different ways of viewing life, and particularly two very different ways of navigating adversity of various types in your life. So on this side, we have what I would call using joy to bypass grief. Using joy to bypass grief. So these are the people that seem to have the inability to be sad in their life. Where are my Enneagram 7s in the room? Okay, no offense, but this is you. And I think you know this is you, right? So Enneagram 7s, and others too, but especially Enneagram 7s, are known for doing this. They're always chipper, always happy, always upbeat. Sometimes they're even more upbeat when they are trying to outrun negative feelings or circumstances in their life, right? So if you're a fan of the show Parks and Rec, anybody watch Parks and Rec in the room? Okay, this is Chris Traeger. This is Rob Lowe's character, right? He's always upbeat, he's always happy. Sometimes even when he's sad, he sounds happy. Like it's bizarre how he expresses it. So this is his character. This is the character Joy in the movie Inside Out, if you've watched it. This is the character Tigger in Winnie and the Pooh. Anybody remember Winnie the Pooh from back in the day? So these are the people that every time they feel negative emotions coming on, they just attempt to fill their life with more fun, more excitement, more pleasure, in hopes that they can prevent the disappointment and sadness from getting in. Do you know the type of person that operates like this? Okay, just for clarity, this is not what Paul is doing. He is not using joy as a way to bypass grief. But plenty of people think that is what Paul is doing. Plenty of people think, honestly, that that's what being a Christian is about. And I would argue it's not. But then there are people that find themselves on the opposite end of the spectrum. We could call that something like allowing grief to prevent joy. Allowing grief to prevent joy. So these are the people that look at the world around them, that look at their own life, and they only see grief. So in Parks and Rec, this is Ben when he loses his job. This is the character Sadness from Inside Out. This is Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. Everything is terrible, no exceptions. This is the mindset. These people look at the news, they see grief in the news. They look at their family and they see grief in their family. They look at their personal life and they see grief in it. They look at their dating life and they see grief. In their work life and they see grief. Now, I do want to be sensitive here to the fact that many of you in the room, I know from walking through your story with you, have experienced what feels like a disproportionate amount of grief in your life. And in no way am I trying to minimize that or make light of that this morning. That is a terrible situation to be in, and we know that because we've walked with a lot of you through dealing with that, processing that, getting help to process all of that. But here's what I do want you to see. Paul, as he writes this letter to the Philippians, was in probably the perfect situation to allow grief to prevent joy. The walls were closing in on him from nearly every angle, politically, situationally, personally, vocationally. I mean, you name it, right? You don't get in much worse of a spot than the one Paul was in when he wrote this letter to the Philippians. And yet his response in the midst of all of that, in the midst of that situation, was joy. To rejoice, to seek out and identify things to celebrate even when they don't seem obvious, even in that type of situation. And he does that not as a way to escape from his grief, but as a companion to it, as a counterweight of sorts in his life. In other words, Paul is doing what he calls elsewhere, and we talked about this in week 1, he's doing what he calls grieving and yet rejoicing. Grieving and yet rejoicing. He writes in his letter to the Thessalonian church, we grieve, but we do not grieve as those without hope. Both simultaneously. Paul is grieving. He's just also rejoicing. That's the idea that Paul's trying to get across. So listen, if you tend to err personally towards the left side of this chart, I get it. It is often far easier to bypass grief than it is to deal with it. I get that it is easier to just chase pleasure and fun and distraction instead of staring at the overwhelming headlines in the world and staring at the broken parts of your own life. I get that. But at the same time, I do want to tell you, you cannot run from grief forever. It will eventually catch up with you. And when it does, you are going to need more than just fleeting pleasure and distraction to get you through it. You're going to need something more substantial than that in those moments. And if instead you err towards the other side of this chart, I also get that. There are plenty of things in our world to be grieved about. For many of us, there are plenty of things in our personal life to be grieved about. They're everywhere. And I understand that when people like Paul say things like rejoice always, you are probably inclined to roll your eyes, grow frustrated at what he says, and think to yourself, yeah, but he just doesn't get it. He doesn't get how truly bad things can be. But as we discussed in week 1, I think this letter shows us that he does understand how bad things can be. And he still thinks it is possible for followers of Jesus, because of the message that Jesus is king, to rejoice even in those circumstances. So this passage changes how we think about adversity. Second thing I think it changes is how we think about evangelism. How we think about evangelism. So let's talk for a moment about a word that I think many Christians today have grown to hate. And that's the word evangelism. So when I use that word, if you're not familiar with that terminology, I really just mean the practice of telling other people about Jesus. That's what the word evangelism means. So Paul was under the impression, according to this passage, that wherever he was, wherever he found himself, whatever circumstances he found himself in, he was put there for gospel purposes. To the point that even when he got thrown in prison for telling people about Jesus, he thought he was there so that he could tell more people about Jesus. Wherever Paul was, his understanding was that he was there for gospel purposes. And like it or not, whether we wish the Bible said it or not, the same is true for you and I today. An essential part of following Jesus is understanding that you've been put wherever you are, your job, your classes, your vocation, whatever it is, you've been put where you are for gospel purposes. An essential part of following Jesus is doing everything we can to tell other people about Jesus. Now, I think there's a couple of reasons that we today tend to shy away from that word, evangelism, and really from the practice that it describes. One, I think, is that we've seen it done poorly at times, or at least we've heard of it done poorly, right? We've seen people go about evangelism in really pushy, overly aggressive, insensitive sorts of ways. There's a certain strain of Christianity out there that almost seems committed to making people feel as uncomfortable as possible as a result of having the gospel shared with them. And so a lot of us see and witness things like that, and we think, yeah, I'm not going to do that. And to some of that, I say yes and amen. It is important to note that you do not get extra points for how uncomfortable you make the hearers of your gospel presentation. In fact, I would argue that within reason, you should be as normal as you can about it. I would encourage you to get to know the other person that you're talking to so that you can speak the gospel into their life intelligently and sensitively and relevantly, as opposed to going, "Hi, I'm Kent. I would like to talk at you for a few minutes about Jesus." I think that's a great approach to take, is to be sensitive, to be understanding of the person we're talking to know things about their life, to learn things about their life so that we know how to most helpfully point them to the hope of Jesus. By all means, feel free to take notice of normal social cues in how you talk to people about Jesus. Amen? Totally good with you doing that. But at the same time, I would guess that there is another reason that many of us shy away from anything resembling evangelism. I would bet that for a lot of us, it's not just the potential awkwardness. For some of us, I think it could be that we are lacking what the Bible calls boldness. Look back with me at verse 14 up on the screen. This time we're going to read it from the ESV translation. Paul says, "And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear." Paul is of the conviction that when people witness the forward progress of the gospel message, like the Roman believers were witnessing through Paul's own imprisonment at the time, when people witness that, Paul thinks, it has a diminishing effect on fear and a multiplying effect on our boldness. When you witness firsthand the power of the gospel message, the timidity that you feel towards sharing the gospel starts to disintegrate before your eyes. In other words, the more you see the gospel's impact, the more bold you become about the gospel. So can I just ask you, if you are mostly hesitant to share the good news of Jesus with people in your life, how often do you sit and marvel at the impact of the gospel in our world? If you want, just start with the impact that the gospel has had on your own life, if you're a follower of Jesus. How often do you marvel at the gospel's impact on your own heart and mind? Do you ever stop and think about who you were a year, 2 years, 5 years, 25 years ago? Do you ever take time to celebrate and rejoice the things that God has done in your life over that period of time? Or what about in the lives of others? How often do you point out and single out and celebrate the unbelievable work of sanctification that you see happening in the lives of those around you that follow Jesus. Because of the gospel. People in your life group, other believers in Jesus in your life, other people that you share life with, do you celebrate those things in them? Or maybe even back up a step for some of us, are you even living life closely enough with other followers of Jesus to be able to spot that sort of thing in them when it happens? Have you ever witnessed someone, as we've seen countless times in our community here, have you ever witnessed someone in your life go from being far from God to being a committed follower of Jesus over time? Is it not an unbelievable thing to watch? How often, in addition, do you sit in amazement at the impact of the gospel on our world as a whole? Have you read about what's happening in parts of the world like China with the underground church? Have you kept up with the gospel movement in places like Iran, where quite honestly, it should not be having an impact from a purely human perspective, but is? There are places where you can go online and you can read stories about this stuff happening. You can go online to places like Voices of the Martyrs and International Mission Board and Open Doors, and you can read about what God is doing around the world. But I assure you, it is happening in profound sorts of ways. And I'll just add to all of this, even if you don't regularly take time to witness any of the things that I just mentioned, have you just read verses like Colossians 1:6? Look at this with me. Paul says, the gospel is bearing fruit and growing. Where? Throughout the whole world, just as it has been doing among you since the day you heard it and truly understood God's grace. Bearing fruit and growing throughout the whole world, Paul says, and among us. Here's my point. When you witness the unstoppable power of the gospel message on a regular basis, you will grow in boldness and you will decrease in fear. It is inevitable. So if you are lacking in confidence for proclaiming the gospel to your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, your family members, your classmates, I think what you need to do is just return to the power of the gospel message itself. We need to pull up a front row seat to the power of the gospel on display in our world. We need to spend time marveling at the power that it carries and let that power propel us forward into boldness. This is why Paul says elsewhere things like this, for I am not ashamed of the gospel because it is the, what's that next word? Power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. What Paul says in this passage changes the way that we think about evangelism. And third, it changes the way we think about other Christians. I'll get on my soapbox for a second here. Is that all right? I think it's a scripture-inspired soapbox, but it is a soapbox. Can I point out something that I've noticed among followers of Jesus? Sometimes I have found that we love to hate on and critique and tear down other Christians. Like, it happens a lot. I don't know if you've seen this. It certainly happens a lot more than you would expect it to happen for a community of people that Jesus prayed over and over again would be unified. Sometimes we sure do love us some friendly fire within Christendom. And to be honest, I think sometimes it's even worse in this part of the country where there is a church on nearly every corner. Sometimes I think that creates this dynamic where each church essentially feels like they have to carve out their little corner of the market, so to speak. So I'll hear people say things like, well, my church is a discipleship church. Well, my church is a church for the lost. Well, we're a church that actually cares about justice. We actually care about the Bible, sound theology. And the list goes on, right? The tone is the same, but you fill in whatever word you want to fill in. And often what I've found is that implicit in statements like these are veiled critiques of other churches and other Christians. we sometimes, especially in this region of the country, we treat other churches like they're rival gangs instead of partners in the gospel. And sometimes I've found that we do the same thing when we're talking about other Christians from our church. Well, obviously, that person's not as mature as I am. Yeah, they just don't know how to think critically about spiritual things like I do. They'll get it eventually. Yeah, they don't get it yet. And then what we'll do is on the other side, we will hyper-analyze and pick apart other people's motives who seem further along than us in the faith, simply because we're insecure about them being further along than us. So sometimes we can treat even the Christian life like it's a competition rather than a journey alongside fellow sinners. And I've got to think that while all this stuff is happening, Satan is laughing his head off. Because he's got us taking cheap shots at each other rather than locking arms together for the purpose of the mission of the gospel. And we are making his job easier by the day when we operate like this. He is sitting with his feet propped up, watching us collapse from the inside. But here's where I think what Paul says in Philippians challenges that mentality. Paul brings up people in his world who are preaching the gospel with clearly impure motives. And what does he say about them? Do you remember? According to verse 18, quote, "But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice." So what if our posture towards other Christians, other churches, other denominations, other movements wasn't critique, but rather joy? What if we rejoiced when we saw another church baptize more people than we do? What if we celebrated when another church with more people in it than ours, when they are reaching people that we probably wouldn't be able to reach? What if we thanked God when it became obvious that someone in our life group is light years further in spiritual maturity than we are? What if we celebrated when a new person in our life group reads a book that honestly we think is a little bit shallow, but the Spirit used it to help them grow in their faith as a result? What if those things became sources of joy for us rather than sources of jealousy and comparison and insecurity and critique? You see, Paul was able in his life, even when he saw people preaching the gospel with bad motives, to rejoice because even then it meant that the gospel was being displayed and proclaimed. What if that became our mindset as followers of Jesus? This is why a few weeks ago we brought local church up here who's planting in Powell. They literally have their first gathering today. We brought them up here and we said, hey, these guys are awesome. You should totally consider giving money to their church, even if it means you stop giving to us for a moment. And you should honestly consider going and planting with them because they need more healthy people to show people what the gospel is in Powell and Cards. That's why we did that. Not because we're awesome, but because we understand that we are partners in the gospel with other churches and other movements and other Christians in our area. We need every church in Knoxville to be proclaiming the gospel if we're going to have a shot at making a dent here in this city. What if joy became our mindset towards other Christians? What if we said, well, yeah, I don't love some of their motives, but man, am I glad they're reaching people with the gospel. Yeah, I don't know that I agree with their methods. I don't think we would go about it that way. But I sure am glad they're finding creative ways to proclaim the message of Jesus to people. Yeah, sometimes I get weird vibes from them. I'm not sure what that's about, but I love what they have to say about Jesus. Can you imagine how much jealousy and discontentment that would eliminate in our hearts? And how much joy it would generate as a result. Now, just to clarify here, Paul is not saying that anyone and everyone who claims Jesus is worth celebrating. In many of his other letters, in fact, he elaborates at length about people who preach what he calls other gospels. In other words, people who are not preaching the gospel message at all, but preaching something entirely different. People who preach legalism or self-righteousness or self-fulfillment and call it the gospel. People who deceive people into error under the guise of the gospel. Those people, Paul believes, should be called out, should be exposed, and should be urged to repent. But when someone is preaching the true gospel message, even if their motives are off, Paul says we still have cause for joy, because that means the gospel is being preached. I wonder how much more joy we would experience if we thought about other Christians, other churches, other denominations, other movements like that, like Paul does. So, I think this passage changes the way we think about adversity, the way we think about evangelism, and the way we think about other Christians. And I realize that in some ways those are three very different topics, right? And maybe some of them stand out to you as things that you need to sit with and process more in your own heart, in your own life. And some of them, maybe you don't need to process as much. All of that is fine, but I think it's worth asking, what is it about this passage from Philippians that covers all of that ground? I'd say it's that this passage is about sources of joy. It's about ways that looking at our situation and circumstances differently, whatever situation and circumstance that happens to be, can actually take us from a place of despair or grief alone and add to it tangible sources of joy. You see, ultimately, Paul believes in the message that we highlighted at the beginning of our time this morning, the message that he himself was preaching and was in prison for preaching. And that's the message that Jesus is king, which means that ultimately, King Jesus is in charge. He's in charge over and above adversity of varying types. He's in charge of evangelism, people coming to know Jesus, and he's in charge over and above even Christians with bad motives. God is able to use any and all of that to achieve his kingdom purposes. According to the scriptures, nothing is outside of the purpose, power, and redemption of King Jesus. And according to Romans chapter 8, we know that because of the cross. If God did not even spare his own son, Romans 8 says, but graciously gave him up for us all, won't he also give us all things with him? If God was working for good then on the cross, surely he can work for good in all other things. If he could provide reason for joy, then Hebrews says, for the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross. Then surely he can provide us with sources of joy now. So in just a moment, we're going to go to the tables all around this room. We're going to celebrate that reality of the cross together. We're going to take the bread and the cup, the symbols of the moment when God did not even spare his own son. And we'll ask that through taking those elements, God would create within us true, lasting, defiant joy despite our circumstances. Let's pray.